Good morning. Welcome to today's genealogy program. I'm Jessica Wortman with the Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center, and we're glad to have you here. Before we get started, I've got a few announcements. So have your pen and paper ready because we've got a lot of exciting stuff going on this year. You may have heard Canyon City is celebrating its sesquicentennial year, so 150 years of Canyon City. And a few things to announce in that regard. So each month has a bit of a theme, and those themes will be celebrated at the First Friday events each month. And you can keep an eye on what's going on with the sesquicentennial events at canyonsity150.com. And keep an eye on that website. All of the events and the happenings will be updated there. Kind of the big event coming up is the Jubilee, and that'll be April 2nd at Canyon City High School. And from 3 to 6, there'll be what we're calling the City Fair, where there'll be booths set up, activities, and all sorts of entertainment happening. And then at 6 o'clock will be the Jubilee itself, and that'll be in the Tiger Stadium on the field there. And it'll be a theatrical representation of our town's history. The Canyon City High School Marching Band, as well as Encore, will be performing, and the whole thing will be wrapped up with fireworks. So make sure and mark your calendars for April 2nd. And we've also got a new exhibit opening at the museum. And so that will be opening March 9th. The exhibit is called Glancing Back and Moving Forward, 150 Years of Progress in Canyon City. So we hope you come down and check it out. And also on February 24th, I'm kind of moving backwards on the timeline here. February 24th, we'll be having an event at the museum called Community Coffee Club and Conversation. And the topic will be colorful characters of Canyon. And so if anyone has any memories, any stories to share about any colorful characters of our history, come on down. We'll be having coffee and donuts and just discussing these fun stories of our history. And the last thing I would like to encourage everyone to head out in the community, take a look around, because one of the things we've done is hang historic window clings in a lot of the buildings around town. And so we were able to find old photographs from different businesses and city buildings in town, create these window clings, these signs in the front windows of the following locations. And so the museum has them, as well as City Hall here, Classic Furniture, Kaleidoscope, the Steeple Event Center, Salon de Chevaux, the Gift Chateau, Three Rocks Engineering, Canyon City Public Library, Canyon City Police Department, the Rio Grande Hotel on South 9th, and then coming will be also at Yarned and Dangerous, the Chamber of Commerce, and Key Paint. So I hope you get out, take a look around at those. They're pretty neat. And then, take a look at the local businesses that they're representing. So today's genealogy program is on land records, and land records may not be the first place we think of to look when we're doing our genealogy research. But I bet that understanding how to look into those and read those land records probably offers a wealth of information, and I'm really excited to hear what Terri has to share with us today. So without any further ado, I'll hand it over to Terri Meeks.
Thank you, Jessica, and welcome everyone. And yes, we're going to use land records this morning to search out some of your genealogy information. In case you're having any trouble viewing or hearing the presentation, you can send us an email. And we're going to jump right in. Approximately 90% of the population in the 1800s owned land. When you think about immigration, voting rights and ownership of land were two of the most important things that immigrants look forward to. So that's one reason we want to look at some of these records. When searching the records, you want to go 40 years past the time you think your ancestor either died or left that particular area. The reason for that is that the land deeds and the records might not have been filed until the person actually passed away, and then they might be in will records, or if they left the area, they had to then sell the land so that the next owners would have title to it. Deeds may not have been recorded, as we just said, until that buyer was ready to sell the land. So these are some of the oldest and most complete records available, because you had to have title to the land in order to sell the land. So even if the courthouse burned, every effort was made to reconstruct the information for land records. What are a couple of the things that you need to know when looking for land records? Well, first of all, who actually purchased the land? Was it the husband and the husband only? Was it the wife and the wife only? Or did they purchase the property jointly? You'll need to know also the state and county where the land was located, because you need to be able to locate the courthouse for that particular area. If you're actually doing the research by going to and visiting the local courthouse, you would need that information, but you also need the information even if you're looking online. And many of these records now are online, especially at familysearch.org. These records might reveal quite a bit of information. First of all, there's the location. It's going to put your ancestor in a specific place at a specific time. We have a huge gap in the census between 1880 and 1900 as the 1890 census burned. So in that 20-year period, we're talking potentially about an entire generation that might have moved, been born, or died during that time frame. So land records might be able to help you reconstruct some of your family information. By the same token, land records can form a bridge between the 10 years of the census. Did your family move between 1870 and 1880? When did they leave one particular area, and when did they move into the next area? Land records may also give you clues about the wealth or the poverty of your family. How much did the land cost? Did they acquire their land by a quitclaim deed for a simple sum of money? Did they acquire their land through one of the various acts that was passed by Congress? Or was it simply a deed? And how much did they pay for that land? How many acres did they acquire? When they moved to a new locality, did they purchase their land immediately? Or did they wait a while before? So in other words, if they appear in an 1870 census, but you don't find them purchasing land until 1872, were they saving up for the purchase? They might identify spouses and other relatives. So who are they buying the land from? Is it a transaction between people of the same name? So is a father transferring land to his son as he ages? Is it simply a transfer within the family, or is it are they buying it from a corporation or directly from a bank held property? And by the same token, who are they selling the land to? Is it a neighbor that is expanding their farm? Or are there other circumstances, but it's to someone that is known to these people? And land transfers might also occur as the result of death. So in all cases, know who your neighbors are, because in many, many cases, you might be related to them. Families married into their neighbors. So look at all of the people that are in the local area to see if perhaps you are indeed related to those people as well. Today, we're going to take a look at the different kinds of land records that might be available to you. And you'll see the listing here. And we're also going to talk about some maps, not all maps, but some maps. And we're going to talk about the two different survey systems. Throughout the presentation, you'll be seeing descriptions of land written in two different ways, and we'll talk about those. We're going to jump right in with the headright system. This was a system that originated in Jamestown, Virginia, and it applied to the original 13 colonies. And at this time, a legal grant of land, usually about 50 acres, was given to settlers. And in this particular case, it means that everyone in the family got 50 acres of land. Even some of the servants got 50 acres of land. So if you have a family of 5 people, you're going to get to about 250 acres, which is a sizable chunk of property. So because poorer Englishmen could not get to the colonies because they couldn't afford to pay the passage from England to Virginia or one of the other colonies, they signed indentures. And it was the wealthy Englishmen who were willing to transport these people. And this is where the system of indentured servants started, especially in Virginia. And this system eventually did lead to slavery. In the case of the indentured servants, they had to pay for their passage on the ship by working off their time. So they might have to be indentured for 3 to 5 years. Number one, to pay off their transportation, and then to get that piece of property. Excuse me. The system was used mainly in the southern coastal colonies. And one of the reasons was here was a large tract of land and they needed labor. They also needed a tax base. So they would attract new settlers, and by having the free land, and then they would work it, pay their taxes, and work the land. The headrights could be sold. And as we have said, they weren't 100% free. You had to pay for your transportation. And if you could not, then you became an indentured servant. The headrights system gradually went away and became part of the bounty warrant system, especially after the Revolutionary War. There was a headright system also in the Republic of Texas. And here again, they wanted to encourage settlement. They wanted English-based citizens to move into the Spanish-held territory, and they wanted to build a tax base. So the acreage was based on when the person arrived in Texas. And there were 4 classes of headrights according to the following dates that are listed here. Those that had families received more land than single men. And we'll take a look at one of these certificates. And we see this is a 3rd class certificate. issued on the 25th of October, 1839. That's when Mr. P. Smith arrived in the state, in Texas. I don't want to say state. And he was entitled to 640 acres of land. Agreeably to the provisions of the act passed in January 4th, 1839, extending donations of land to late immigrants. And he's actually receiving it on the 7th of January in 1840. We just mentioned bounty land warrants, and this system was in effect from 1775 up until about 1855. The colonies did not have the money to pay their soldiers that were fighting in the Revolutionary War. So as compensation for their service, bounty land warrants were issued. By the same token, once the nation was united, the states did not have the money to pay their citizens for service in the various wars. So bounty land warrants again were issued. The certificates were given to eligible veterans, granting them rights to free land in the public domain. And the word public domain is a key and critical definition here. Public domain lands were in the western part. And at the time, we are talking as far east as Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi. So those were public domain lands. They were given for service in the Revolutionary War up through the Indian Wars. And either the veteran, or if they had passed away, their heir could make application for a bounty land warrant. And they had to provide supporting documents. If their application was approved, a warrant was received that granted them either land or scrip. Now, they did not own the land at this point. They just got a warrant that entitled them to get land. And the warrant was used to apply for the land patent, which actually certified ownership. The warrants here again could be sold or exchanged. And think if your ancestor might have been a widow in Vermont. She might have taken that warrant, and she isn't going to want to move to Ohio in her later age, especially as a widow. So she's probably going to try and sell or exchange that warrant. Few soldiers actually did receive the title. They did, for the most part, sell or exchange their warrants. And the applications are available through the National Archives. Not online, I might add. Here is an example of one of those land warrants to the principal surveyor of the land set apart for the officers and soldiers of the Commonwealth of Virginia. So this is land probably in the western part of Virginia, not in the public lands area. This shall be your warrant to survey and lay off in one or more surveys for Henry Perry, his heirs or assigns, the quantity of 100 acres of land due unto the said Henry Perry, in consideration of his service for 3 years as a soldier in the Continental Line. And this was given on the first day of August in 1783. If you were not aware that Henry Perry might have served in the Revolutionary War, this is one of your key documents that is going to lead you to look further. And much of the Revolutionary War service records are available via Fold 3. Here is another one from Georgia in Burke County. Pursuant to a warrant dated 7th of May, 1787, we are having land measured and laid out for William Aldridge, and he is going to get 200 acres. And it describes the land as a tract of land containing 200 acres on Briar Creek, near land granted to William Tillman. So we get a neighbor here. And we're looking here again in the 1780s. So it's important to know who those neighbors are, because the families might have married into one another. Bound on all sides by vacant land at the time of the survey. And in this particular case, we even get a brief map of Briar Creek. We see William Aldridge getting his 200 acres, and it's in Georgia, so it's pine land. Here's another one to the geographer of the United States or the surveyor appointed by him to survey the military lands. You are hereby required to survey for Mary McMullen, administratrix of Hugh McMullen, deceased. So in this case, we are probably getting a widow who is applying for the warrant. Hugh was a sergeant in the Maryland line, and she is applying for 100 acres of land in any of the districts appropriated for satisfying the bounties of land. So, and this is from February of 1890. So some of these records are very, very old and extremely valuable. Here is a later one with a warrant number 66521 for 40 acres issued in favor of James A. Booth, a private in Captain Bush's company, Georgia Militia, and he is involved in the Florida War. You'll note that this was in the 1850s, so this is a considerably later time. And we have a description of the land that he has received the warrant for, and it is subject to sale at Dixon, Illinois. And in this particular case, he is actually transferring his warrant to the assignee, John O'Brien. So Mr. O'Brien is going to acquire the 40 acres. And he is apparently at this point getting full title because it is signed by the president, Franklin Pierce. We also have land patents. And this is the first transfer of land title from the federal government to an individual. These are not from states, but from the federal government. And these records are available from the Bureau of Land Management, General Land Office at this particular web address. And we will see this again later on. If you want to take a screenshot so that you know the website, that's fine. And this is what that website actually looks like. And you will see the land patents. Since the land is coming directly from the federal government, all of these will have the signature of the president at the particular time. When you click on that land patents button, you get the opportunity to enter the state and the county and the person's name. You can enter as much information as you know, or as little information so that you get more potential results. Now, this is federal land, so not all states are going to be included in this, and we'll talk about that later. We searched for Puckett, and we see in Randolph County that there are quite a number of Pucketts, and we see the various dates that they were granted land. We get document numbers, and we actually get the description of the land that they acquired. By selecting image, we then get the actual paperwork. And this is from 1824. So James Monroe was currently the president. And we have Thomas Puckett of Wayne County, Indiana. And he has registered at the office in Cincinnati. And we have the description of the land that also appeared in the first chart. And he's getting 160 acres, a quarter section of land. This is the lower part where the land was sold in Cincinnati, and Thomas Puckett is acquiring. Because of immigration and because of the westward movement of the citizens, there were numerous legislative acts beginning in the middle of the 1800s. We're not going to cover all of them by any stretch of the imagination, but just know that your ancestor might have acquired land through one of these acts. The first one that I have located here is the Preemption Act of 1841. And this act permitted squatters on federally loaned land. So it was people that had moved into the land early on and had not actually purchased it. It might not have been available for purchase at the time, but they are now being given the opportunity to actually purchase the land before it was open to the general public. And they were allowed to buy the 160 acres at $1.25 an acre. There were requirements in that they had to cultivate the land or make improvements. And this act was repealed in 1891. It was probably superseded by many of the other acts that came about. There was a Swampland Act in 1850, and it was to help reclaim land along the Mississippi River, and the person would receive federal aid. So they could purchase the land for a nominal fee, or were perhaps given the land, as long as, here again, they made improvements by reclaiming it. One of the most popular systems was the Homestead Act, which came about in 1862. Person had to be a citizen at this point. So here again, it became very important for immigrants to make sure that they had filed the paperwork to become citizens. The applicant had to be 21 years of age or older. And it became more important later on, after the Civil War, that they had never borne arms against the United States. Now, the land itself was free, but there was a $10 filing fee. And here again, they were able to acquire 160 acres of unappropriated public land. There was a Timber Culture Act in 1873, and the qualifications for that were very similar to the Homestead Act. You had to be 21 years of age, a citizen, etc. And they were allowed to acquire an additional 40 acres as long as they were planting in trees, and they had to tend it for 10 years before they received the actual title to the land. There was a Desert Land Act that you could get a whole section of land at $1.25 an acre. And you had to provide some irrigation for at least a part of that land. I don't know who would want to buy it, but Timber and Stone Act. And you could get 160 acres of land that were unfit for cultivation because there were timber and stone. But you could make a lot of money by harvesting timber or perhaps opening a quarry. Getting access to these various acts was extremely popular, and many of the railroads were willing to transport you from the east to these areas so that you could acquire your land. And we'll see another one for Montana. You could get free homestead land. And it was sponsored by the Great Northern Railway. Here is one of the grants for the Homestead Act. And you'll notice this is application number 1. And it's from Daniel Freeman in Brownville, Nebraska in January 20th of 1868. And he has made payment in full for a description of the quarter, 160 acres that he is going to acquire in Section 26, Township 14, I believe, Range 5 East. And interestingly enough, they do have photos of Mr. Freeman in his later age, as well as photos of his land and the buildings that he built to improve the land. And he is number 1 to complete his homestead certification. Here is a deed from the Timber Culture Act. It is from North Dakota. He lives in Trial County, and it is a Nils Wald. And this is he again is getting 160 acres, that quarter section in 1891. And here's one for the Desert Lands Act. And it's from September of 1902. And Willie F. Davis is in Roswell County, New Mexico. A description of the land he is acquiring, and he is getting 80 acres. And he's paying $20 for that acreage. This is going to start a series of documents, some of the things that you might be able to find, especially for the Homestead Act. This is an application made by Lemuel D. Lehman in November of 1872, and a description, the northeast quarter of Section 32, Township 14, Range 1 East, for 160 acres. Lemuel is applying for this land based on the Soldiers and Sailors Homesteads on Railroad Lands Act of July 15th, 1870. So this was land that was originally allotted to the railroad and is now being turned over. This is one of the ways that they paid for the railroads to be erected. And this is an affidavit where he states that he was a corporal in Company H of the 2nd Nebraska Cavalry. So based on his military service, he is applying for land. And there are going to be several other documents that go along with this. So the War Department certifies that yes, he did enroll on the 22nd of October in 1862 at Plattsmouth, Nebraska, and that he was mustered in, and he was going to serve for a period of 9 months. He was mustered in on the 18th of December of 1862. And when his unit completed their service, he was mustered out along with the rest of them in December of 1863. So he served a little bit longer than the 9 months required. Here again, we find his discharge that certifies the time that he spent in the service of the cavalry. But what's interesting is, here's a little bit of biographical information. He was born in Decatur, Indiana, and is 34 years of age. He's a physical description. He's 5 feet 10 inches tall. He has a light complexion, gray eyes, and dark hair. So what did your ancestor look like? He's quite tall for someone at this particular point in time. There's also a questionnaire. This is just one of 3 pages in the questionnaire for qualifying for the Homestead Act and getting the actual certificate of ownership. So when did he settle on the land? On November 19th, or excuse me, November 9th, 1872. And he has resided there himself since that time. And is the land associated with crops, or is it associated with some other, for example, mining industry? No, it's not for that, but it is for farming. He has made his home there. He has built a house. He has built a stable and a granary, dug a well, and he has planted 5 acres of forest trees and 2 acres of fruit trees. And he's also planted 100 acres of wheat, corn, oats, and barley. So he has made great improvements on the land in order to get his final certificate. This is actually his payment. He's paying $8 for this 160 acres of land. And he finally gets his final certificate that he now, in 1879, 6.5 years later, fully owns this northeast quarter section. So we've covered ways for people to acquire land at either free or at a nominal price. We also have deeds, and these are probably the most popular records that we have. but they are also underutilized, and we do need to take a look at them. They do document the transfer and ownership of land and or property from one party to another. And this can mean land, which is real property, or they can also pertain to movable or what we call chattel property, such as household goods, or in the case prior to 1870, enslaved persons. When looking for deeds, you want to look first at the index. And this applies to whether you are actually at the courthouse looking for this information or whether you are looking online. Remember, initially I said you might have to look 40 years into the future to see where your person might have sold the land. And it will give you the backwards date of when the actual deed and they acquired the land was given. So don't just jump into the deeds in a county thinking that you might find them readily. Start with the index and go get that information. The index will give you a book number or letter, and it will give you a page number that will refer you to the deed book. All of these books are extremely large if you're working in a courthouse. You want to look at the grantee indexes first. Those are the listings for the buyers, and that will help you to determine when your people actually entered the area and when they might have purchased their land. Don't overlook land records because, as we have seen, they might give some personal information. They might contain wills. The land might be transferred as the result of a death. So there might be a will in there. There might be guardianship records and sometimes even citizenship records that you might find in these. Here is an example of a Grantor Index. It happens to be for everybody that is listed. This is from 1913, so they are separated by years as well, and it may be a block of years. But these are everyone with the surname that begins with CO, not necessarily in specific alphabetical order, but generally COs. You'll notice that the first part of the alphabet for the first names are divided out, in this case, into 6 separate columns. So George falls under this particular section of the alphabet. Mary falls under this particular, William under this. So that helps you to determine or read across for the names. It says who is actually purchasing the land and when the deed is actually what the actual date of the deed is. And this is what we were talking about. Here are the book numbers and the page numbers that you will need to reference when looking for the actual description of the land and any other paperwork that might be included. This is for a city, so we see that there are other descriptive forms here. So here is, for example, one of those. This 22nd day of March in the year of our Lord, 1887, between Ingersoll F. Knowlton and Hannah C. Knowlton. So we've got a husband and his wife and a George W. Knowlton. Now, we don't know the relationship of George to Ingersoll. Is he a son? Is he a brother? There would be other information. And since this is from 1887, we could check a census to get the relationship. these three of the first part, and Carrie A. Gravelove of Albany, New York, of the second part. And these parties for the sum, I'm looking, the sum of $1. And this is a quit claim. So chances are that Carrie Gravelove is perhaps a married daughter of the Knowltons, since they are selling the house and the land for simply $1. And because this is in a city, she is actually purchasing all that house and lot of ground known as house number 119 in Green Street in the city of Albany, bounded on the north by a house and lot formerly owned by one William F. Benedict. And it goes on further on the east side by the actual street. And it will describe all four sides of the land or more. Here is another index. We have grantors and the people that are actually purchasing the land. And we see that we've got a couple of different Edwards that are buying land from Mr. Bancroft. Here is the book letter, and these are all book letter A. We're going to take a look at Mr. Brock on page 90. Know ye that Perry G. Brock of Saline County, state of Missouri, for the consideration sum of $10 to be paid by David Anderson of the said county. And it gives a description. He is purchasing 20 acres. And it gives the description. Here's the 20 acres, and he is getting the south end of the east half of the southeast quarter of the section, township, and range for that particular land. And this is where maps are going to come in very, very handy. And we'll talk about maps in a little while. This is one of those gold mines that you might find in land records. To the Honorable, the commissioners appointed to ascertain claim and title to land in East Florida. The memorial of James Hall and Eleanor Hall, his wife, formerly wife of Robert Pritchard, deceased. Wow. John Creighton and Mary Creighton, daughter of the said Robert Pritchard. So we have Ellen Hall. We know that she was married to Robert Pritchard and that she had a daughter, Mary, who is married to a John Creighton. We have Anne Stallings, widow of Elias Stallings, also daughter of the said Robert Pritchard. Robert had a son and another daughter, Amelia, who was unmarried. So here's one of those genealogy gold mines that you might find in among land records. This happens to just be a transcription from Trigg County, Kentucky. And we see that Benjamin Ladd is going to sell and grant unto his son, Edward B. Ladd, the balance and residue of his land, which in the original survey was 200 acres. And he now lives there. But he has also already conveyed land to his sons, William and John, Here again, this is 1821. Prior to that, every name census. So the land record is calling out that Benjamin had a son, Edward. He had a son, William. He had a son, John. So valuable genealogical information. And after the decease of Edward's wife, or Edward's mother, Nancy. So we now know that Benjamin also had a wife named Nancy, that the land would be fully vested to him. We also see that he has a slave, a Negro boy named Henry, who is being transferred in the land. So if anyone is of African-American descent, you definitely want to look at land records because slaves were considered property. Land lotteries. We're all very, very familiar with the fact that Oklahoma, in many cases, parts of it were settled by a land lottery. But did you also know that Georgia also had land lotteries? There were 8 of them early on between 1805 and 1833. And usually they were lands that were held by the Creek and Cherokee nations. The lot sizes varied, starting very, very large in 1805 with as many as 490 acres. But by 1832, that had dwindled down to 40 acres. Participants were given slips of paper, which entitled them to a lottery, to get a parcel of land. And Ancestry does have at least the 1827 land lottery results. And I just typed in the name of Smith, and they do have that information. What's interesting here is that they note that this woman is a widow, for example, but Sarah is illegitimate. So it's interesting how she might be acquiring land. Oklahoma likewise had land lotteries. There were 2 places, either in El Reno for the northern or Lawton for the southern district. And here again, the applicants received a ticket and a ticket number matching a particular tract of land. And they were permitted to enter and inspect the land. And if they didn't want it, they could trade or sell their ticket, or it was turned into so that the next person could get it. There were more than 74,000 tickets issued, and there were actually 2 land lotteries in Oklahoma. The Oklahoma Historical Society does have an introduction to these land records, and they also have a listing of those that number about 100 only that were unsuccessful in acquiring land during one of the lotteries. And we do see the various ticket numbers up into those 74,000s and which of the 2 lottery locations they registered at. There were also land runs in Oklahoma. In 1889, they decided to divvy out the unassigned lands. And this was land that was left vacant after the Civil War. And it was supposedly to create reservations for the Plains Indians, but now they're releasing it for settlement. In the spring, the would-be settlers lined up and camped on all 4 borders. And at noon on April 22nd, 1889, the starting signal was given, and there was a wild dash to choose your 160 acres. They also, apparently this was successful because they decided to go ahead and have 3 more runs in September and April of 92 and September of 93. This is information from an Oklahoma tract book. And I found this information very difficult to find. They do have the tract books and they are organized by date. But here again, if you don't know exactly when your person, which run they participated in, the information is hard to find. It is arranged by township and range. And each of these people got their 160 acres. These are who got it and the dates in which they acquired the land. And there are Oklahoma tract maps as well. When we talked about wills, we talked about dower rights as well. And these were primarily to protect a right, the wife who was not on the title to the land. So if a husband bought land by himself, and it also goes the other way for if a wife purchases land, it will protect the husband. But early on, we see most of these to protect the wife. A portion of the husband's land had to be allotted to the wife upon his death. These dower rights were primarily used during the 19th century, but I was surprised to discover that Ohio, Arkansas, and Kentucky still to this day have dower rights. The widow was entitled to 1/3 of the estate, but it was only during her lifetime. She did not own the land. And one thing that's important in land records is that if the husband sold any of the land during his and her lifetime, she had to relinquish or release her dower rights. From a will, we see an actual map that is drawn out. There is in the will, the actual description of the dower rights is listed, but this is the estate of John Coonrat, and his son, Adam, is getting his part of the land, and his wife, his widow, Sally Coonrat, has gotten her dower rights. And here again, this is one of those important things. This is a dower release. We did go to the within named Sally Lee and examine her privily and apart from her husband, whether she freely and voluntarily relinquished her right to the within mentioned land. And she saith that she doth freely and willingly relinquish her right to the same in fee simple. What's interesting about this is signed on the 30th of November, 1813, well before the every name 1850 census. So we find Sally's name. We don't know her maiden name, but this may be the first time that you see her given name. So where do we find these records? As I mentioned earlier, if your people were among the first people to settle in a particular area in the Western lands, the Bureau of Land Management, General Land Office does have those records. Ancestry does have some land records. They have pension and bounty land warrant applications. They do have homestead records, and they do have indexes or indexed county land ownership maps, as well as others by county. Family Search does have an extensive collection of land records. Locating them in their catalog may be a little bit difficult. And don't forget to also look for land records, perhaps under probate. The county courthouse in the particular area where your ancestors lived, or the state archives for that particular state might also hold land records. Here's a listing, for example, from Ancestry for the various counties, Montgomery County, Tennessee. You'll see in some cases, it might simply be an index. We have county and state for various others. So use the Ancestry catalog to see if perhaps they are on, your family might be there. In many cases, these records are indexed by name. So if you enter your ancestor's name, you might see them directly. Whereas Family Search, you're probably going to have to do a search. The records are all browsable. They may not be indexed. If you actually visit your local courthouse, as we've said all along, you need to know the county where your ancestor lived and the time period that might be involved. You're going to want to look. And here again, this also applies to looking online. You want to look at that Grantee Index to see when they're buying their land, or the Grantor Index to see where they're selling land. And both will be for a specific time frame. One of the things that I have noted in doing some research in land records is that your family may have stayed in the same county, but they may have bought and sold several pieces of property. Remember, early on, or prior to World War II, fertilizer did not exist. So depending on the crops that they planted, the land may have played out and they sold it to someone else who was going to grow something different. If you don't find them in the county that you expect them to be in from, say, the census information, look in adjacent counties. The courthouse in an adjacent county may have actually been closer to their home and land, or perhaps the roads might have been better to get to that adjacent courthouse. So don't be discouraged if you don't find something. These are what the actual books do look like. And these are both the indexes as well as the actual deed books. Here again, we have a Grantor Index. So these people are selling. They're all named White Knight. And we see the division of the alphabet like we did in one of the initial examples, except this time it's only 3 columns. And we see that H.E. and his wife, Mary, are selling to Lena. The important information, that book and page number. In this particular instance, they have actually listed the date of the deed. And we see various ranges of dates. What I want to call your attention to is when the deed was actually recorded. And in many cases, it's a little bit, here's a 3-year gap. But here's one from 1883, and it wasn't until 1907 that the deed was actually recorded. There again, it's that, think in terms of perhaps when the mortgage might have been paid off. So 30 or 40 years later. We have talked about public domain lands and unclaimed land, and there are 2 major distinctions. State land states. The original 13 colonies, as well as a couple of other states, did not cede their unclaimed land to the federal government when they became part of the United States. So they retain the right to have land offices and sell the land from the state level. And we see Virginia and Texas as well as the original 13 colonies. The state land systems use the system of meets and bounds to survey their land. The public domain states are the 30 remaining states, and they're the states where the federal government originally surveyed, controlled, and granted the land. And they use what is called the public land survey system, and we commonly refer to that as the township range system or the rectangular survey system, and I've even seen it called the Jefferson survey system. Meets and bounds. Just like the other, it's a system of surveying the land. The meets are the direction and the distance of a line, and that line is part of the boundary of the property. The bounds refer to the naming of physical features in defining that. And we're going to take a look at one of those records. Here is a case of Mr. Joel Hamby, and he is getting 250 acres. And to it beginning at the White Oak on the south side of the creek, thence north, 50 west, 180 poles, a unit of measure, to a chestnut on the bank of the little stream, thence north, 40 west, 74.5 poles to a stake. So, and it goes on from there. So we see how this system of meets and bounds works. Very complicated. Whereas when we use the public land system, we have the ranges, townships, and their subdivisions. One section was a 1/4 mile, was a 1 mile square that contained 640 acres. And they're very easy to work with. We have a 6 mile square grid. And within that, we have one section that is 640 acres. They in turn were might have been divided into quarter sections, and each one of those could then also be subdivided, and so on. Land ownership maps. There are land ownership maps for particular years that are published in county atlases, plat books, and original land entry maps when people moved into that particular area. And they are arranged usually by a specific date. They might be available also in your county courthouse. They did not make these every year, but did make them frequently. So they show the location where your ancestor was located. And some of that important information is what are the families who lived in the surrounding homesteads. Early people tended to marry their neighbors, so chances are you're related to some of these people. Here is one of those meets and bounds land ownership maps, and it does give the name of, I realize it's kind of chicken scratchy, but it does give the name of each one of the owners of these particular irregular shaped pieces of property. And I apologize for the darkness of this, but this is one of the Jefferson or rectangular systems. And you see where we have an entire 1 mile section that has been divided into quarter sections, further subdivided into half, or even a quarter of a quarter section. I'll now open it up if there are any questions. And apparently, if you do have any questions and if you want to type them into the chat function, Dan is standing by. And if not, I'll turn it over to Jessica.
Thank you, Terri. As always, that was really great stuff. A lot of good information there. Just a couple of things that jumped out at me I'd like to touch on real quick. You said that one of the last slides there was a little chicken scratchy, and a lot of the older stuff is hard to read sometimes. And so I just wanted to remind people, if you are in the Royal Gorge region, come on down to the History Center and the museum. We may be able to help you decipher some of that. And we've got people, on staff who have been trained and studied a lot of that. And so if you're having trouble kind of interpreting some of that, bring it on down. That's what we're here for. If you are elsewhere, I would encourage you to find a local history center, because that's what they're there for as well. Yeah, another thing that you'd mentioned, and this is kind of a little bit different topic, but Brandon and I had gone to a presentation in Cotopaxi, near here. And it was interesting. It wasn't until the 1970s that they even had house numbers, and their plots of land and the survey notes was just kind of like what you were just saying. It was from the middle of the railroad track, 40 paces or whatever it was. But then there was kind of a lot of room for interpretation there, because there was a main and there was a siding, and they had both moved a couple of times over the years. And so when they went to actually sort that out and properly draw up those lots, it was trickier than it sounded. Anyhow, thank you so much. Again, we've got a lot coming up with the sesquicentennial. Keep your eye on the website, canyonscity150.com, and we'll see you all next time. Thank you for joining us.
And I hope you'll enjoy, come back to us next month on Saturday, March 19th. The Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center has a vast collection of records that you might want to entertain for your genealogy research. It's very easy to find census records on the internet, but there are other records that exist perhaps in smaller community assets. So we're going to take a look at all the various things that the local museum here has, and that perhaps a museum, historical society, or genealogical society might house in the area where your ancestors came from. Thank you very much for joining us. And as a reminder, if you were not able to capture all of the information, this video will be uploaded to the museum's YouTube site. Thank you again, and have a good day.